Hello, everybody. Hello, people are still joining. That's wonderful. It's great to see such a crowd. I hope that you will stay with us for at least some time. Uh, I'm Mark Lipovetsky, and together with Daria Ezerova, we are running for the year now the uh, Russian film series at Columbia under the support and supervision of the Harriman Institute. And with much gratitude to the Harriman Institute, who is our platform. And we were beginning as a normal film series with film screenings and discussions afterwards, but certainly the COVID pandemic has changed the situation, and now we are having panels, discussions on the films that we can watch elsewhere. So Dasha is the postdoctoral fellow at the Harriman Institute and the film expert, and I'm very happy to work with her. So that's our joint project, and I am feeling very much nervous seeing so many friends among the attendees and so many film experts there. So I will try to be less pushy than usual, because we have quite a few film experts in on our panel today. Our subject for the discussion today is Andrei Konchalovsky's most recent film, The Dear Comrades, and Dasha will introduce it to the audience, although I have a feeling that the audience is familiar with the film.
Thank you very much, Mark. Like Mark said, we're focusing on Andrei Konchalovsky, or Mikhailkov Konchalovsky, as is sometimes credited. Latest drama, Dear Comrades, Дорогие товарищи. And the topic that we, kind of the way that we wanted to approach this film today, Dear Comrades, New Historical Cinema, is very much a continuation of a number of conversations that we had in this film series since it starts 2 years ago now, which is the emergence of new cinematic language to represent the events of Soviet history. And our last conversation dedicated to the topic was on Kantemir Balagov's film Dilda, Beanpole, that received polarized opinions, specifically insofar as the accuracy of the film is concerned, with regards to historical representation, which is, of course, also a major concern for Dear Comrades. Right? There is this kind of purported realism of this film that Koncholovsky is pushing really hard. And at the same time, it raises quite a lot of question about historical accuracy and the politicization of representation in this film, both kind of from the standpoint of Soviet history, but also vis-a-vis the current political climate in Russia. So that's first aspect of the film that I'll hope we'll get to talk to today. And just a couple of more aspects that I'd like to call our audience's attention to is, first, when we talk about someone like Andrei Konchalovsky, and I should probably preface this by saying that our series for the past 2 academic years was dedicated specifically to new Russian cinema, new names, sort of mostly millennial filmmakers. And Konchalovsky is kind of an exception to our usual selection. So when one is talking about a filmmaker such as Konchalovsky, we really do need to keep in mind that for someone like him, we're talking about decades and decades in filmmaking, both Soviet and Russian. Konchalovsky's career, and I actually looked up this number, spans almost exactly 40 years. I think depending on what you consider the start of his career, it could be 40 or 41 years. So when talking about Dear Comrades, it of course merits to think about how this specific film fits into his work that was surely very diverse, and it's one way to think about it, that this filmmaker on the one hand was a frequent collaborator of Andrei Tarkovsky. At the same time, he worked in Hollywood, made Tango and Cash, did a very dubious adaptation of The Odyssey, and then now this. So there really is a lot that can be said about the evolution, or perhaps different strands, in Koncholovsky's creative biography. And the last aspect that I would like to focus on before we introduce our amazing speakers today is the critical reception of the film. That's there's been quite a roller coaster to follow, really, because on the one hand, in the Anglophone media, the film was lauded to heavens. It was named masterpiece. It was named brilliant, uncompromising, etc. In the Russian critical media, critical press, the reviews were mostly positive, but when they weren't positive, they were quite, they were quite polarized. So if you sort of look through the headlines and some content of the Russian response to the film, it really runs the gamut from saying that this is Koncholovsky's best film, without doubt, so uncompromising, so brave, to this is the most indentious film one could ever make, that it is best described as in našem i vašem, which is to say it would work well on the international film circuit, and it will fare well on Channel 1, and even within the kind of strictly Russian context, it would be palatable to both the kind of the apparatchiki and the liberals and the opposition, right? And kind of the same polarized opinion went to stretched as far as the kind of the performance of the lead actress Yulia Vysotskaya, who's the wife of Andrei Konchalovsky. One review describes this role as her absolute tour de force, that Vysotskaya has never been better. And another review says that she's completely flat, she is fake, and even her Southern accent fails most of the time in the film. So we're really dealing here with something that there has been very little consensus on in kind of in both domestic and international media. And at the same time, many reviews in both Russian and English completely omit the fact that the person who sort of saves the day in this film is a KGB operative, which seems to be a very politically loaded element in the film, yet is consistently ignored in quite a number of reviews. So I'm going to stop here, and we're going to start introducing our speakers. So our first speaker today is John Mckay, who is a professor of film and media studies and professor and chair of Slavic languages and literatures at Yale University. He completed a BA in English at the University of British Columbia in 1987 and a PhD in comparative literature at Yale in 1998. He teaches a wide variety of courses on literature, Russian culture, cultural theory, and film and moving image media. His current research interests include documentary and experimental film, early Soviet culture and its later reception, Marxist theory, the comparative and cross-linguistic study of film and media concepts, and the comparative study of the short story form. Among many others, his publications include Inscriptions in Modernity from Wordsworth to Mandelstam, 4 Russian Serf Narratives, True Songs of Freedom, Uncle Tom's Cabin in Russian Culture and Society, and the first volume of Dziga Vertov Life and Work. That's if you have missed the fantastic event with John yesterday, you should go to UCL's website and revisit it so you can hear him speak more about this fantastic multi-volume project. And a forthcoming book, Film Theory, A Very Short Introduction. Mark. Mark, you're mute.
Forgot it. I'm sorry. Our next participant is Pavel Hazanov, an assistant professor of Russian at Rutgers University. He completed his PhD in comparative literature at University of Pennsylvania in 2017 and is currently working on finalizing his book manuscript, The Russia That We Have Lost, the Pre-Soviet Past as Anti-Soviet Discourse, which analyzes the formation of contemporary Russian mainstream political ideologies within the recollections of the imperial era in books and on screen from the 1960s through the 2000s. And in addition to this, he's the author of a number of quite thought-provoking articles and generally an expert in the late Soviet culture, so which explains his presence on this panel.
Right. And our third speaker today, to whom I owe my interest in this film and the many, many, many challenging and provocative conversations about Dear Comrades, is Peter Rutland, who is a Colin and Nancy Campbell Professor of Government at Wesleyan University. He works on contemporary Russian politics and political economy with an interest in nationalism. And his current project is a book manuscript entitled Visualizing the Nation, which explores how political nationalism has expressed itself through visual media, film, television, and the internet. And Peter is also an associate editor of Russian Review. So as our audience can see, we really gathered the foremost experts on all of the aspects of today's topic for discussion. So without further ado, as per usual, we're gonna give each of our speakers 5 to 7 minutes to express their opinion on the film. Any thoughts, any details that you find particularly important or compelling in this film? And as always, speak in the order, yeah, maybe less than that.
Please, in any order. Who would like to begin? All right, Peter, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Okay, following the Marxist tradition, start with the base, with the economic foundation, and then the other guys can deal with the Nadstroika. So I'm a sociologist. I'm not a film person, although I love movies. And so I didn't know much about Koncholovsky. I knew who he was. I'd seen a couple of his films. And when I heard that he was making this film, I was very excited because I'd started off studying workers' movements. I wrote an article about the Russian coal miners' strikes of 1989. And so this is something that I've been interested in for a long time. And I'd never studied Novocherkassk, but I was aware it was out there. So I was really excited at the thought of there's going to be a movie about this. So I came to it with a really open mind and with a lot of enthusiasm for what I was going to see. And then as I watched the film, I got this kind of alienation effect. I couldn't quite figure out what was going on. And then when I'd watched it and kind of thought about it, I realized, or I came up with my hypothesis about it as not an anti-Soviet film telling truth about the past, but as an apologist film, effectively, as a film told from the elite point of view, because we don't actually really get any sense of the workers. The workers are just this kind of crowd in the distance who are shouting and throwing things and trashing things. We don't get any sense in the film of the workers. We see the queues, but the hero figure, the woman, goes around the queue, pack it in the back. And so I was kind of puzzled by this kind of this curious approach to a film about a workers' movement without any workers in it. And then I started reading around and looking at interviews with Koncholovsky, and some of them recent, like the PR interviews he was doing in Venice, where they won a special prize, jury prize, and some of them going back 10 years, interviews in the press. And I was really quite disturbed by what I found. He has a lot of comments about praising repression, basically saying things like, freedom does not bring prosperity, praising Stolypin, praising Stalin. And even there was one report about how he used to hang out with the assistants of Yuri Andropov in the early 1960s and was kind of drinking with them at this period when the Novocherkassk happened, right? So again, I'm not an expert on Koncholovsky. I don't particularly want to become one either, but that biographical dimension started to kind of make sense to me in terms of this film. And the fact that one of the questions already asked, why was the Ministry of Defense helping with this film? Well, it was sponsored by the Culture Ministry, funded by Alisher Usmanov, generally seen as a Kremlin-friendly oligarch worth $21 billion in personal wealth. And this is a pattern which my colleagues can talk about of the Russians trying to win prizes in international competitions by backing this kind of film. And as Dasha was saying about the Western appeal, addressing historical revisionism like his previous film, Paradise, about the Holocaust, this is a kind of thing which is going to ring bells in the West, presumably, if a Russian director is confronting black holes in Russian history. That presumably is something which will go down well in the West, as indeed, by and large, it has. And again, I hadn't watched Paradise before watching Dear Comrades. After I watched Dear Comrades, I watched Paradise, and I have a much more negative view about that film. I think Dear Comrades is a beautifully made film. It's quite gripping. So I can see why people like it. I wouldn't diminish those qualities of the film are really excellent. I was just looking at it more from a sociological point of view. So I'll end at that point and look forward to hearing what the others have to say.
Thank you, Peter. That's quite a provocative beginning. Thank you very much.
I think I will jump in next because I think that I want John, who is an actual bona fide film expert here, to seal the deal as we get there. And just to build, I feel like I'm somewhere right between Peter and John in terms of my line of expertise. So I want to say that there are sort of three vectors that I was really two vectors that I was following along as I was thinking about this film. One vector is the vector of the religious plot of the film. The woman as basically this Mary Magdalene figure, right? She starts out as this fallen woman, right? In as many terms as possible, she literally starts out in this act of adultery, right? And we see her naked, and it sort of emphasizes all of those taboos of Soviet culture that would even be on screen. But obviously, we're talking about a post-Soviet movie, but still, the whole kind of it's quite jarring actually to have that black and white 4:3 frame, historical perspective, and then insert that kind of scene that would be utterly unthinkable in Soviet cinema in that moment in time in 1960. And so we have her introduced as this fallen woman in as many senses of the term as possible. We follow her into the bathroom with her daughter, where she gives her a talking to, right? We assume that when she sees the KGB agent who comes to her house, that she's gonna sell her daughter out to him the second that she's gonna come home, right? And then she supports who was it? As Salvini recently said, a strong cleaning with strong methods of the protests. So she goes out and she has that super Stalinist party line, right? And then her big moment of conversion, right, is when she goes and she prays in the bathroom to let her daughter be alive. She then goes and searches for her daughter. Her daughter's body just disappears in a truly Jesus-like sort of way, where she thinks it's there, but it's not. She promptly leaves and baptizes herself in the river, right? And receives her repentance, right? And then in response to that repentance, she sees the miracle of basically the resurrection of her daughter, who is still alive. And in that moment, we now know that she's not going to sell her daughter out. And nevertheless, there's this moment, right, when she goes and she undergoes her repentance. She still sits in that car, right? And she talks about Stalin, right? And she says, oh, well, Stalin, if Stalin were here, none of this would have happened. We would have already had communism. And this moment, right, is this moment that Anton Dolin, the critic, like highlights for him, oh, this is the scariest part of the film, that even after everything that she's seen, this is the scariest thing. But I don't think that this is actually what happens in that moment. I think what actually happens in that moment is a switching over from the idea of the good Stalinist with good methods and strong cleaning to the switching over to the idea of Stalin in the way that he's remembered by the Narod today, which is Stalina na vas net. As in, like, if Stalin were here, he would put an end to all of this ridiculousness with all of these people in charge, the KGB running amok, all of the kind of this general sort of like this big father signifier that you sort of that you sort of relegate all of the bespredel, right? All of this kind of like chaos and failures of the present moment. You sort of fantasize the idea of this kind of a mythical Stalin figure. So in that moment, when she sort of talks about Stalin, she switches from being this party apparatchik talking about the good old days of Stalin to talking from the perspective of this baptized Narod, talking about Stalin. So she, I think that's basically her religious plot. And that religious plot is then mapped onto this historical event, right, of the strike at Novocherkassk. And what's absolutely amazing is that this film, right? I mean, notoriously, right, the Soviet cinema and post-Soviet cinema is quite an elitist affair, right? And it's often about the elites, and often has like plots about the elites, and especially the Koncholovsky, who like cuts his teeth with like Dvoryanskoye Gniezdo, right, nest of the gentry, right? And as Dorin also reminds in his review, says, you know, like he puts on the film opens with the national anthem that his father wrote all three versions of the lyrics to, right? So and also that I didn't know this, that the anthem was played without words between 1955 and 1977. I didn't know that they fundamentally didn't yet nail down what the post-Stalin Soviet words would be. In any case, the film starts out like this. It starts out with all of this tying up of this elitism and being about the elites, and it's quite impressive that you managed to have a film still be about elites even when you are in Novocherkassk, right? All these ways like in which this film recalls like the visual language very often of like Muratova with like there's like there's these like little snippets where you see these brief encounters kinds of moments for the way that this person is stylized. With her like apartment, with her job, even just being in this area of this kind of light Ukrainian kind of thing. So all of this stuff is like she's still mapped onto a kind of an elite drama, right? Like that somehow the story in Novocherkassk becomes about the elites, and the basic idea. The very purpose of the protest turns out to be to baptize the elite. The protest is not about itself. The protest is about baptizing the elite with that conclusion where she stands there, "С народом так нельзя, будем лучше." You know, like you can't deal like this with the people. We have to be better, right? The choice is not it's the narod never sort of as a cognitive as a cognitive category never disappears. It's never questioned. It's never interacted with. This totally vapid idea of this like totality of the hordes that are outside, that they might have something to say. None of that, right? You can't ever deal with that. Not even for 1 second does the narod interrogated, and certainly not even for 1 second would you consider that the narod should be in charge. The only thing that should be considered is whether the narod is right or whether they're wrong, but it's the elites who should be in charge. And I really think that that sense of no passage into consciousness of the narod, right? There's no passage into consciousness of the people. Really, I think really perfectly coincides with that opening of the film where you see those big blue letters, Alesh Rusmanov представляет, and that like, he presents. And I really thought of that slogan, right? That from the protests of 2011, 2012, right? The slogan of Pasha Arsenyev, right? Вы нас даже не представляете. You cannot even imagine us and you cannot represent us, right? This is precisely how Alesh Rusmanov imagines and represents. So in that sense, I think that that to me was the takeaway, to sort of take this film about an event, to turn it into basically the baptism of the elites that continues reinscribing this category of the narod that's still fully foreclosed from any kind of intervention. I will stop there.
Okay, I guess it's my it's my turn now, I guess. Can you hear me? Can you hear me, everybody? I'm audible. Okay, great. Thanks so much to everybody, to Dasha, Mark, Peter, Pavel, for those wonderful comments. I actually, because I really couldn't figure this film out, I ended up writing a whole bunch of notes, so I have to time myself. Otherwise, I actually wrote a whole bunch of things about it, so I'm gonna time myself so that I stop, because otherwise, so the timing has started here. So I'm gonna experiment by thinking about this film as a melodrama, and I'm gonna use some various ideas that have been developed in terms of thinking about film melodrama, including the utilization of music, which is present in this film mainly diegetically and ironically, although not uninflected by nostalgia, the strong presence of social pressures, the inability of characters to act freely, the use of stereotypes all over the place, the frequent alternations between emotional extremes, and above all, the privileging of the victim's point of view. And that's going to be very important, because often in melodrama you have figures, often couples, who stand out by virtue of their passions, their passion for themselves, for each other, or for an ideal, and because of this they're more interesting than the bland conformists who surround them. And you can think of lots of examples. Those of you who know US film, Sirk's melodramas, you know, All That Heaven Allows. My favorite Soviet melodrama is Amphibian Man, actually. Человек Amphibia, which is, I think, a great melodrama. And this passion, in either its content or its intensity, can't be contained or tolerated by the existing order. And so this relationship is targeted for destruction. And the targeting constitutes a kind of judgment on the existing order, its limitations, its incompatibility with true freedom and equality. And so there's an intense binary established between the good side and the bad side. This elicits strong emotional displays, and often a kind of, at the end, the revelation of what Peter Brooks calls a kind of moral occult, right? Some sort of salvation moment at the end. And this relates, I think, to what Pavel was saying. And one can see a kind of dominant binary of this type in this film as well, especially in the second half. So familial love and concern versus the violence of the state, especially maternal love, right? The underscored by the scene of the dog and the pups. I mean, this is something straight out of D.W. Griffith. Like, what was that, you know? And it seems to be Koncholovsky's own view, right? That this kind of maternal, instinctual kind of thing, right? But again, very melodramatic, last-minute rescue, grief turning into overwhelming relief, and a promise to do better. But here's the complication, is that this family versus state thing is only one of the ethically or politically significant binary oppositions in the film. There are a whole bunch of them, and they don't overlap or coincide. Usually there's a kind of dominant binary in a melodrama, but here they proliferate. So, one, the conflict of generations, almost in a Turgenev-like sense, right? The Svietka, the thaw liberal versus Yuda, the Stalin supporter, and so forth. But even within the KGB itself, right? There's the new Victor, the new KGB thaw guy, versus this scary unnamed general who's with his tattoo, who apparently is he from the Yezhov period, and then he was in a camp or something? I don't know. I want to hear what people think about this whole tattoo thing, right? Is that, you know, he waxes lyrical about how to shoot people en masse and so forth. Then, of course, there's the other generational difference with the Djet, Luda, and her dad. But I think the Djet actually represents the future. He represents, in many ways, the opening of the archive, the return of religion, and so forth. He doesn't really represent the past, right? Then there's, of course, the conflict between the various instances, right? The various institutions. Above all, the army and the KGB, and the KGB is seen itself as being split. There's this local thing, and then there's the national, and then there's this kind of elite units and so forth, right? And this is all tied up with these with a sequence of calls for arming. Who should arm, right? So Basov says they need to be armed, and Yuda says they need to be armed, and then Kozlov and so forth, right? All these people, right? Then there's, within the context of the film itself, there's of course this conflict between citizens and people who are, at least from the point of view of figures within the film, citizens and non-citizens, citizens and criminals, right? The supposed presence of pardoned criminals in the town among the striking workers, right? And this is the real sort of Antigone question. Maybe some of you know that that Koncholovsky directed Wysotskaya as Antigone in Oedipus and Colonus a few years ago. But that's the Antigone question, right? Who is a citizen? Who counts as a citizen and who doesn't, right? But of course, then the thing that Peter and Pavel have already talked about, workers versus management, right? With workers left as almost total ciphers in this film, right? Svietka is hardly an adequate stand-in, I think, for them, right? Not even sort of the usual kind of reactionary ideas that, you know, they're motivated by resentment or drunkenness. We don't even get that much, actually, in this film, right? Just the basics. Big rise in prices in food, the lowering of the salary. There's no before or after. Like, you sort of expect there'd be some sort of thing about the people who were executed or nothing, right? There's no sense of their living conditions, their difficulty. You know, people were living in barracks and tents and so forth. So why can't Koncholovsky deal with these people at all? I mean, what's the problem? Why is this impossible? What workers knew of labor actions they had largely assimilated, according to some historians anyway, from films, school books, volumes about the revolutionary movements. And in fact, the apparatchiks in the film are not totally wrong about Leninism, right? Because in Leninist thought, trade unionism had a distinctly pejorative connotation. It smacked of moderation, accommodation, rather than repudiation of the established order. Remember, those of you who've read What is to be Done, all these attacks on working class trade union politics, right? So yes, the workers were in fact mobilizing the image of Lenin and other Bolshevik slogans for purposes contrary to Leninist traditions, but as political tools for what could have been an actual class struggle. So rebels in the name of the Tsar, basically, right? But to return to the melodrama idea, this is the last thing I want to say. So as I said, melodrama sides with the victim, right? But the question here is, which victim, right? When you watch this film, you're put in the strange position of having to make choices about who's the victim, right? Even if the director doesn't seem fully aware of this, right? This film multiplies the axes of victimhood beyond the capacity of a melodramatic framework to control, right? In many ways, I think the film demonstrates, perhaps inadvertently, the inadequacy of melodrama as a form of social critique, because this society is just too messed up on too many levels. It's too repressive on too many levels for that kind of mechanism to be adequate. And one last thing I just want to say is that a kind of blockage kind of results, it seems to me, in this film, and I find this reflected in the look of the film as well. I actually don't find it quasi-documentary at all, except maybe in the set design and the art direction, which is quite beautiful actually. And even though it's kind of pared down, I mean, compare it with German and his, you know, the sort of proliferation of details in his films, right? It's not improvisational at all, right? It doesn't really look to me like thaw-era Soviet film either, because those films have those Baroque camera movements and so forth, and you know, whereas Dear Comrades has relatively little camera movement, a lot of long shots. It has a kind of eerie stasis to it. It seems more influenced by photography than by film. And photography, of course, is a significant theme in the film, from the ones that are hanging on the wall of Lyuda's apartment, in the Garkom, and then, of course, the ones that are also taken by the KGB officers in the crowd, which are real. Actually, some of those appear in Samuel Baron's book about the Novocherkassk events, right? There, you actually see some of those photos in the film. So that's what I would say about it. It seems to me a kind of melodrama about how melodrama doesn't work in order to really analyze these kind of events. So hopefully that was somewhat clear.
Thank you very much,
Thank
John.
you so much. That was very clear. And
Mark, just
very interesting.
before,
And we have a wonderful group of experts. They have basically demolished all the questions that we prepared for the discussion, since they answered them in the best way possible, but we'll try to improvise. And we are hoping that our audience will be helping us as well. So please feel free, and we already have some add your questions to the Q&A or to the chat in YouTube if you are watching us on YouTube. And we received a couple of questions beforehand from Tom Kent, from Chen Wong, and our panelists have already seen them, and they will probably address them when talking about pertaining issues. But my first question would be still about the issue that you already touched, and obviously did a homework and know a lot about the events behind this film. Of course, it is one of the unique episodes in the history of late socialism, at least in the USSR, right, with the attempt of the workers' uprising that was brutally suppressed. And suppressed exactly in the year which we typically consider the highest point of the thaw, the highest point of destabilization, and what's not. What's my impression of the film is that Koncholovsky probably read less than you guys about this film. He interviewed several people, and they interviewed themselves, but mainly he was using Wikipedia article as his inspiration. It's a very good Wikipedia article, I should say. It's a brilliant Wikipedia article, and all main facts that appear there, they appear in the film, but they appear in the strangest way. They appear as the text. For instance, somebody says, okay, here is the attack, somewhere happening the attack on the train and people are in the coaches, right? Or somebody saying the crowd is demanding Budyonna and Voroshilov because they represent the Red Army that sort of liberated this region from the whites. These are very dramatic episodes, right? As well as even Wikipedia has names and figures of workers and activists, etc., etc. But for some reason, this extremely dramatic story is completely sort of flattened and turned into the background for melodrama or for the religious conversion story, if we follow John's or Pasha's cues, right? So how do you understand this transformation of the historical material, right? Koncholovsky himself says that there's no difference between fake history and real history, and that one usually believes in character, not in facts. But I didn't find lots of sort of deviations from the history, but I found this strange transformation. What do you think? What is his method of dealing with history? Who would begin? Yes, Peter, please.
Peter.
Well, I would say it's a very, very selective approach to history. And I think he's explicit in some of his interviews that he's not approaching it in terms of telling the truth. He doesn't believe that truth exists. So I find myself convinced by Pavel's argument about a religious conversion story. I hadn't noticed that. I mean, but it makes perfect sense. And I'm not sure to what extent Koncholovsky was kind of structuring the whole film around that or how it fits in. But I think as a historian, he's not doing us a very good job. And in terms of the historical accuracy, I'm not a historian, I don't study the Khrushchev period, but it does strike me that he puts a huge amount of effort into kind of documenting how a repressive state apparatus works in kind of loving detail about how you monitor the crowd and how you get information, how you get people to sign those things saying it's a state secret. It repeats it over and over again in the same scene basically is repeated a couple of times of people signing those bits of paper. So I think he's really trying to kind of ram home this leviathan of a state, which, nobody can escape from. Apropos the earlier melodrama point, people being trapped, nobody can get out of the way of that machine. That's what he's trying to convey, the power of the state, its ruthlessness, its cruelty, its brutality. And he gets that across. But the kind of political message that comes at the end is, and we can't do anything. This is the way it's always going to be. That could be the kind of closing credits, you know. Similar, back on the question of the victims and turning the Communist Party officials and directors into victims. Even the KGB guy becomes a victim. And again, they had the same scene twice, right? Of the party officials in the boardroom being forced to flee and crawl out of the building. And they did that twice.
Yeah.
Whereas one event which isn't shown in the film, which did happen, was that some workers were arrested on the first day, and then a crowd went to the police station to free them on the morning. And that's where the first killing took place, in the police station, a tussle, you know. And that's not in the film at all. Again, that would have been a very dramatic scene if you're interested in telling the history, or if you're interested in giving the workers' point of view. But that scene is simply excised.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you so much. John, would you
John, I
like to
think, was
continue?
next. Yeah.
I was just gonna say the same thing. That was one of the most important things that was missing this whole event at the police station. There was there's a few there's really nothing there also about the number of casualties. The history, I read Samuel Barron's book on it rather rapidly, I have to say, and I looked at this other book by a guy named Khazanov about the sections on Novocherkassk, and it does seem as though the history it's pretty unclear. There are a lot of blanks. There's a lot of things that aren't known about exactly who ordered what at what given time, et cetera, but it seems as though it was some kind of sort of meshing between KGB, Army, MVD, this type of thing. But I just would agree with what Peter says. It's just that the history that we really get is the history of the cover-up that happened as it's happening right then and there. The barricading of the city, the asphalt, the morgue, the burials, the signing of the forms, and so forth. That's the real center of historical attention that Lyuda's story in the latter part of the film allows us to follow, is the story, that the chapter having to do with the cover-up, and again, you know, some of that at least accorded with specific things that were in the accounts that I read, but there's certainly no effort to think of this in any kind of a larger framework, and certainly not in relationship to the actual living concerns of workers, whether in this city or beyond, because this wasn't the only place where people complained, although it was the only place where an event of this magnitude happened. So, yeah, I don't understand. When he says I don't believe when he says something. What was the quote again?
He
There's
says there
no
is no
difference
difference between fake history and real history.
I don't even understand what he's saying there. I mean, that's just nonsense as far as I'm concerned. I don't know. I mean, I don't get what he means. I mean, it just doesn't.
I also should probably clarify that he does say it in English. So this isn't the poor translation. This is what he actually said in English because he speaks it. So even if I were trying to kind of like try to retranslate back into Russian while imagining that I'm inside Koncholovsky's head, it's very hard to pin down what he's trying to say there. I think what he means, like abstract, inaccurate representation. I hope, at least. I can't say that.
It may simply be that he's trying to say that, you know, I mean, it may be a very old-fashioned sort of idea, the sentiment typical of an older-fashioned kind of realist artist, right, who proposed to present a truth of some kind through their fictional work, right? The truth through art. It doesn't have to be absolutely, you know, in accord, you know, in some documentary fashion with what historians write or anything else. It's this other kind of I don't know, maybe that's what he means. I'm not sure.
Okay, Pasha, go ahead.
Sorry, I wanted to just jump in because something that I've been really thinking about in this kind of the visual language of this film is how often this film stages these confrontational, oppositional kind of discussions of what transpired in the past or what should happen now. And this kind of they're basically all various versions of secret speech, right? The sense in which you are going to be speaking about these events and the Soviet past in general, right? And they're always staged in this way where there's one character in the front, one character in the back. They're very often not looking at each other. Very often one character is in the shadow, one character is in the light. Very often there's this very intentional reversal where they will actually like run and switch. You can see that especially in the beginning. I think maybe like what is it, 17 minutes in? I actually marked it off. At like 38 minutes in, you can see there in that minute. You see it between her and her daughter, her and Luda and her father, or he's her father, right? Not her grandfather, her father.
Her father.
Okay. That's what I see. Yeah. So Luda and her father, and also you see it with Luda and the KGB man when he comes to visit. He first says something, and then he tells her, "Hey, maybe she's not gonna come home. Maybe she should stay out or whatever." Right? You also sometimes get a resolution where all of a sudden these people that are sort of counterposed on opposite ends sometimes end up being in the same spot, and finally the spotlight is on them. That actually happens. That resolution happens when her father tells her what happened at the dawn during in 1918, 1919, and he says, "Nu Boga нет," right? There's no God at the dawn. Let's drink to their memory, right? And she doesn't drink, but still that conversation happens. So the reason I mention this is because I do think that is one level in which I think this film is trying to tell a certain kind of historical truth about this mode of conversation, about this mode of this mode of secret speech that takes place in this like kitchen table sort of community. I think that to me, sort of to defend Koncholovsky to some degree, I think that's also a dimension, right, of these elite private conversations that Koncholovsky is certainly extremely familiar with from his own family life. So I definitely think that's one historical depiction that for me really does ring quite true.
Yes, that's.
No, I'm sorry, Mark. I couldn't tell who tried to speak first.
Yes, me too. So then it will be that can be true, but and we'll talk about, for instance, the attitudes to Stalin in this film a little later. But may complicate what you said, all three of you, a little bit. Okay, it is the elitist representation of history, right? That takes away the perspective of the other side. And yes, indeed, there is nothing new about that. That would be very much typical for the late Soviet film. And at the same time, of course, it goes into contrast with what we would expect from a film about the revolution, right? So that's and this revolutionary spirit is being invoked there, right? And it was, as we can judge by details, it was there as well, right? But maybe that's exactly the point, to not only to give the perspective of the power on the events, but sort of to complicate this perspective, to represent it as John said, as sort of splitted and not unified by any kind of monolithic ideology and even monolithic attitudes. What do you think? Maybe it is a form of critique. Would you agree with this or not?
Sorry, can you restate the question? I was
this representation of history from the standpoint of power. Maybe it is a critique of power.
I felt like it was, if it's a critique, then it's like a Pelevin style critique, where the only critique is for them to stop talking. But the power reproduces itself through its own critique. Right, it reproduces itself through this ongoing elite conversation about dealing with the narod, right? Just the sheer fact that these are continuing to be the people that speak, right? So it is a critique. It's certainly a critique of a mode of power. I certainly think that Koncholovsky is convinced in one sense that he is a good anti-Soviet. But I also, in the same way that Mikhalkov is convinced that he's a good anti-Soviet, you can be a good anti-Soviet and still be a Tsarist, which is incidentally what both Mikhalkov and Koncholovsky are.
Absolutely.
So, and I think that that's where you end up.
I also, oops, sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
No, I didn't want to interrupt you. I just thought you were finished, but
No,
I can speak up. No, I just wanted to jump in and say that I'm with Pasha on this, and that Koncholovsky at his absolute best is a very reactionary modernist. So to me, he's most certainly will be for this kind of like monolithic vision of power and people. Like he surely doesn't want to present it as necessarily one-dimensional, but I think he definitely, along with his much more reactionary brother, gravitates to this, to give an answer, however upsetting it may be, it will be a totalizing answer that this is the truth of what happened, and that's it. And kind of like towards more of historical accuracy, just something that's since Pavel also brought it up. I personally didn't buy the whole thing with the father and the Казачество and the Tichy and the Tichy Don. I don't think I can say Don without saying Tichy in the beginning of it. I didn't mean to say it like that. I meant Don. But in any case, what I meant to say that again, right, in terms of historical truth, that to me rang somewhat artificial, probably through the kind of the pathos that kind of almost bordered on camp and all of that in that scene. So I was thinking that maybe that in my view, I think John is coming close to truth with saying that this is a foreshadowing of what comes later with the revival of religion and revival of Казачество, actually, kind of post the collapse of the Soviet Union. Because other than watching Gerasimov's Tichy Don from 1957, I couldn't possibly imagine what would drive Lyudmila's father to represent himself in specifically that way. Like, because this is, to me, is just a little bit too much. This is probably when I thought that was overdone. Anyway.
There's one chink in the armor, as it were, of the repressive state, which is that most of the characters kind of break the rules at some point, right? They after extreme assertions of the rules, they then walk away from the rules. Like the doctor is probably the most sympathetic character in a film with any really sympathetic characters. The doctor lets her see the bodies, and then you can't go into the hospital, wink, wink, and she goes into the hospital. So, and then the KGB guy also ends up breaking the rules, right? So there is this sense, and then one of the quotes I saw in a Koncholovsky interview was, he says he doesn't want to live by laws, he wants to live by understandings, by понятия. And so, yeah, the laws are for the masses, and the понятия and the exceptions to the laws are for us. So that seemed to be consistent. But a broader question, which I want to put on the table, is the question of the political relevance today, because it came out in the time of the protests in Belarus and the protests in Khabarovsk. And so this question about will soldiers shoot at crowds is not a historical question. It's a contemporary question, right? And an extremely important question. And my interpretation of this film is that the answer is a resounding yes.
Yeah.
If the soldiers won't, then the KGB will, or somebody, you know. So that's why I found it disturbing, because it's very hard for regimes to get troops to shoot at their own people, right? Like the Amritsar massacre in British India 100 years ago was Gurkha troops shooting at Punjabis, right? So that's the typical empire model. And in the Soviet breakup, the Soviet troops were willing to shoot Azerbaijanis in Baku, Lithuanians in Vilnius, but not Russian miners, right? So that's the context. Now we're in an ethnically hegemonic Russian Federation, and so that question of the reliability of the repressive forces is very much a relevant question, and the answer we're getting from Minsk is a pretty clear answer, unfortunately.
Any comments on the contemporary resonances, which it's a very important question with regard to this film. Thank you for raising it, Peter. Any comments on that?
So to fill the pose, or Pasha want to begin? Pasha, go ahead.
No, I wanted to see what you were going to say, but so I wanted to chime in. I mean, my thoughts, I'm always like, with Relevance, it's always like a question, right? Because when was the film actually filmed? When was it actually planned, right? These production lines are extremely long. I'm not fully sure whether you can like tag it down to the year that it comes out. Though certainly when it does come out, it evokes a certain kind of resonance. I think in the long form, I think that the answer is that the KGB will always shoot at the crowds, right? And I think that in the kind of the what's his name, Dorian, in his review, I think quite rightly says that this film basically suggests that the only political subject, the only political actor in Russian history is the KGB. So you might as well look for the good guy in the KGB because that's your best bet. So hence you get the good guy in the KGB because that's really the only form of positive actor that you can hope for. But I also think that the good guy in the KGB is like fully consistent with this model of the expedient but wise leader who understands like rules and who understands who can hear the people and knows what the people want, says, you know, we were in the wrong with the people, we should do something with the people, right? This is like very consistent with this whole Stolypin kind of ideology, which is really very prominent for the post-Soviet among the post-Soviet mainstream. So I do think that even the KGB guy in the end is not like he's not modeled to be a Soviet KGB operative, and so far he's not like a Dzerzhinsky type. He's really much
he's much more attractive than Dzerzhinsky, which I think is a very deliberate casting choice, just kind of as a side note.
This like место встречи guy. He is like the Putin guy, right? He's like he's the one who or you know how like there was that whole all of those surveys about like which fictional character should be in charge, and it was always like место встречи and like Stirlitz, right? And that's basically the guy, right? That's basically him. And I think that model is a model that is really very closely tied to this imagined idea of this pre-Soviet or like eternitized Russian order of the reform from the top, of the man who determines what the people want and then makes that thing happen without any terrible cataclysms or something. So I don't know. Well, I feel so that in terms of contemporary relevance, I think that's the relevance. The relevance is always like communicating both to the funders of the film and to its viewers and to this kind of liberal mainstream consensus, consistently regurgitating this idea of this like reform from the top, the idea of its possibility, the idea of its inevitability, the idea that this is the only kind of action that happens and that no other action actually counts. And if anything else happens with the people, then they only exist for the purpose of convincing the good KGB man to do something. They don't exist in themselves.
Can I?
Yes, John.
Just one thing. What this brings up too is another question I had, or confusion I had about the film, which had to do with how one might explain the ideology of the characters in the film, like Luda in particular, right?
Please do. That's a question that we were very much look forward to. How do you explain the ideology of the characters?
It may be a more general question than one about Luda. I mean, is her is the ideology that she expresses, is this a matter of habit? Is it a matter of survival, trying to get certain things done for her family? I mean, clearly she's not in love with this Loganov guy, right? I mean, that's clearly right. I mean, she's there's this. It's funny, they wake up and there's this kind of sort of boilerplate conversation about the party and the things that you benefit from and all the rest of it, right? So she's a survivor, right? She's a survivor. And it's funny, if you remember, when she stands up at the meeting and she says these strikers should be suppressed, right? She sits down, Loganov says to her, what did you do that for? And she says, why didn't you stop me? Why didn't you stop me, right? So it's almost like, again, she was so is this someone who's a true believer? Exactly. I mean, how do you distinguish the true believer, right? Someone whose speech is motivated by true belief in Stalin, for instance, right, or whatever, and someone who is saying these things because this is the thing that's going to help me survive through this particular situation, and so forth, right? And I think that there's a difficulty in distinguishing these things. I mean, I have to say this, even I'm cynical, I guess, right? I kept thinking, when Victor sort of drops her off at her house, he says, Luda, am I going to see you again? And so forth. I mean, he has something on Luda, like something big time. I mean, now I kept thinking, wait a minute, now is she going to have to be bouncing between Loganov and Victor? I mean, you know what I'm saying? I mean, this is what I was thinking, right? Again, in order to survive, right? I mean, I'm just sort of, I mean, we saw Victor earlier on in the film, just, remember that scene with the nurse, right? And he's like, ciao, nurse. I mean, this guy is not, a particularly nice sort of a guy, right? So again, this mixing of sort of the ideology associated with your profession, maybe some sort of political commitment to certain kinds of ideals, and then just simply surviving within a system, a kind of utilitarian or instrumental use of certain kinds of verbiage and practices in order to get things done, or to save your daughter, or whatever, right? So anyway, that's a question I had.
Great. And if I may continue on this, don't you think that with Luda, maybe the most interesting part is that on the one hand, we see her as a very much hardcore Stalinist, right? I counted, she speaks highly of Stalin 7 times in the film. And the last time, as Pasha mentioned, it's a prayer. Right? Вот бы Сталина без него не справиться. So if Stalin would be alive, without him we wouldn't survive, basically. Right? So all this catastrophe is, in her imagination, the result of excessive liberalization, right? And that's the, and what she says, execute them all at the meeting, is very much in view with this faith, right? But on the other hand, she is appalled by what has been done to her daughter, right? She is seeking her. She is saying to her KGB body, that were you who were shooting from the roof at people, right? She is sort of in doubt at certain moments, and she sort of dispels doubts at other moments. So she displays this is very much illogical, but at the same time quite organic mixture of different macro and micro ideologies, right? And she's it's really hard to say. She's in power, right? At the same time, she's very much democratic. She goes to the same store, but of course from the back door, right? But she's with the beloved тогда с моим народом, right? And that's a strange representation of power, I would say. What do you think about it?
Right, and also the fact that her daughter, as the representative of the people, sort of is slotted right into, or rather that the voice of the people is slotted into this this version of the Oedipal triangle of this film, right? The mother, daughter, grandpa, right? And that is the triangle in which you get to hear the discourse of the people articulated, right? In both from the daughter for the contemporary workers and from the father from the standpoint of this kind of like whatever the historic Kazachist or whatever the other people. So yeah. There's this kind of privatization, right? There's this like privatization of these conversations. And I think that she is a woman, right? So she comes along with this very typical assumption of like a woman's place is in the home, right? Like the home is like ultimately, this connects to all of those things about like Antigone, right? Antigone violates Creon's law in order to save the law of the family, right? She's torn between the two laws. She must bury her brother, right? And therefore violate the Tsar's law or the whatever Creon, the king, right? So she's kind of like and the reason why Antigone can do that, right, is because she is the woman. Therefore, as a woman, she has this responsibility for the home, and that forces her into this contradictory relationship to power that otherwise she wouldn't have. So I think that like that is kind of like she gets to have this redemption, right, from her Stalinism by virtue of being a woman and a mother in the end, right, in the inside of this film. At the same time, she also starts out as this, I think, a particular kind of monstrosity from the standpoint of all of this anti-feminist discourse of the Mikhalkov brothers, right? This idea that this woman who should be tending to her beautiful daughter in a house and to her war hero father is out there being a Stalinist at all these party meetings. What is she doing? Why is she talking? Why is she volunteering? Why does she have thoughts? I definitely think that that's the position from which she starts, right? And then she ends in that scene of like hugging her daughter on the roof of the house where everything else has disappeared. There's also like part of the visual language that comes along with that is there's a lot of framing devices around her all the time, right? Until the end when they're on this roof and it's just a fully open space. And you also have that fully open space when she gets baptized. So there is that sense of like her passing from all of this self-imposed, wrongly chosen ideological decisions that are driven by her misplaced feminist ideas about power, and in the end, she gets to be a nice, I don't know, Chekhovian character, right? So with this daughter that she hugs, so
Indeed.
All right. This is kind of, I'm going to use my moderator privileges to move us along with some of the questions with regards to the film's choice, but I will also use this chance to kind of go back to the question of ideology with Lyudmila as a kind of a side note. I think that the Antigone in intertext is hugely important, but at the same time, I was thinking all along about possible provenance of Lyudmila's character actually in Soviet cinema. And I think that if one were to go onwards, Panfilov's Proshu Slova from 1975 with very young Churikova, who plays a very similar character of a kind of a party leader, party figure woman who kind of very much represses all of her feelings, including the grieving for her dead son, but ends up in a rather different place emotionally and ideologically. That would be, I think, I think it would be a productive direction to explore. And I'm pretty much willing to bet good money that this is where the inspiration may have come from. Now that we're back to talking about film more specifically, my question is how would you describe Koncholovsky's cinematic language in this film, right? So John already mentioned that, if I understood you correctly, John, that you didn't necessarily saw it as a quasi-documentary or with an allusions to Thaw cinema. Whether speakers, you see that as such or not, please do tell how you would describe his approach to film and what kind of idiom is he operating within, if you were to describe it.
Pasha, would you like to begin?
Me? I'm not the speaker.
No, I was.
No, I mean Pasha.
I
Pasha.
thought you
Pasha.
said Dash. I'm sorry.
No,
Sorry,
no,
that was
Pasha.
confusing.
Pasha, sorry.
I'm scared to sort of speak up because, in the sense that I don't have this deep knowledge of Soviet cinema that Dasha and that John have, so I don't. I fear saying something silly. I do think that I didn't mean to suggest that in terms of its cinematic devices, it was drawing on like Muratova's film cinematography at all. I didn't mean to suggest that. I did mean to suggest that character-wise or sociologically, this Luda is very similar to the sociological position of the protagonist in Brief Encounters, and also her location in this kind of southern area of the USSR, right? So that's the only reason I refer to that film. I don't think that that film has a whole lot to do with this one otherwise in terms of its like visual language. I did notice, I mean, a lot of people in the chat sort of mentioned the reference to Eisenstein's. There's also these like little references in some of the shots, just like a few of the shots that are staged in a kind of a similar way with some of the similar angles and a similar kind of framing and the kind of the stuff being there. I was thinking specifically when they're in that hall and they hear that there's a strike and they hear the sound outside. Like that's basically like, isn't there a scene that's very similar to that in Stachka in the strike in Eisenstein, but also with the sound of the bugles and etc. So but I don't know like what to, I don't know if beyond these kinds of very basic references to those things, I don't think that like there's much more of that visual language being taken. I saw a lot of that photography, a lot of that still stuff, and that's very common for both Mikhalkovs, especially like Mikhalkov of Oblomov or for Koncholovsky's Dvoryanskoye Gniezdo, like this nest of the nobility. That's like that stationary, lingering in the moment, very cinema becoming photography kind of way. There is quite a lot of that. It's weird though, right, to have that visual language or that static visual language about a social movement, right? Like in a sense, like if Eisenstein would punch the Koncholovsky Mikhalkov brothers for many reasons in the face, but I certainly think that to stage a strike with this kind of that level of static language is remarkable. Right, it's a very, very clear choice to not go into the crowd, to not do the things that you would expect that you would do when there are people rushing something and getting shot. Even when you see them getting shot, it's still a still camera standing behind the window in that silence, right, where you just hear the music of the Soviet song while outside there's movement, but the camera is just still, right? There's no Vertov, right? There's no Eisenstein cuts. There's none of that. I don't know, John, what do you think about this?
Yeah, I actually have to say that scene. I have to say that I found that stationary camera. The fact you got that the woman who'd just been cutting Luda's hair not long before, lying in a pool of blood. You don't see her, and then you have this happy song, and then the door opens and you get this roar of noise coming through. I actually found that pretty effective, to be honest with you. I thought that was a powerful moment.
I think that's the best scene, honestly,
yeah, I thought
in
that
my view.
I actually thought that was really well done. Of course, there's nothing like the water cannon scene in Strike or anything like. There's nothing that kind of virtuoso montage. He's really not thinking that way. But I have to say that I found that just thinking about the sound too, there was, and this relates, I think, to other aspects of it. There's a real sense, like you hear the people walking across the creaking floors, like as they're walking. So there are all these long shots as you see, like this office and then that office in the back and stuff, and you hear people actually walking all the way across these wooden kind of creaky floors, right? So that there's this effort, this sonic effort to sort of create the atmosphere of the people moving through it, right? Koncholovsky, I have to say, is capable of a very different kind of filmmaking. I'm thinking of a film made close to this time. I took the opportunity when I knew I was going to do this to rewatch Asya Klyachina.
Yep.
Like that is what an extraordinary difference. Of course, there are some moments when you have that famous interview with the guy with the war veteran who's the kolkhoznik, right? and there's, you know, and it's a static camera and so forth, right? But that's just enormously sort of Baroque camera work and so forth in that film. So he's and there you actually have, you know, it's a different era, it's a Soviet film and so forth, but there you definitely have a certain attention to, you know, even non-professional actors to people's lives. I guess the other thing I would want to point to though is the framing. I thought the thing that's most interesting cinematically to me is the framing in this film. The way that frequently you'll see, it'll be in long shot and so forth, you'll see only part of their body, and you'll see, so for instance, when she first goes into the bathroom and so forth, there'll be these long lingering shots where you're actually more attentive to objects in the room, like a bottle on the table or some other piece of furniture or some sort of other things in the room. Another interesting example of this, when she sees the sniper on top, when she goes out onto the stairwell, we actually never see her reaction. We only see her feet, right? So that there's a pretty careful use of framing in order to conceal and sort of ambiguate what the reactions of particularly her character within this film, I think. So to me, the most interesting thing I would say would be to attend to really would be how the film frames, because again, there's a pretty conscious refusal, I mean, to move the camera much for a variety of reasons. Yeah. So, but yeah. That's just a cluster.
John, the framing that you mentioned, especially in the opening scene, I was thinking that Koncholovsky does it better, but I think it's very similar to like Cold War and Ida and that group of films. At least I saw it that way.
Yeah, that's a really interesting comparison. Yeah. I mean, it feels, you know, to me, it really does feel, although he's using, you know, the old ratio and black and white and so forth, it really did feel to me like a contemporary film. Also,
it's so obviously digital, despite everything else.
It's obvious that there's a digital quality to it. I mean, it's a good image and so on, but there's also and maybe this is deliberate, the very, very strong sort of whites. I mean, you sense this kind of southern light sort of burning down on things at various points in these areas. I mean, there's a kind of burnt out quality to some of the images, and that was also, I thought quite notable. And again, whether people found that effective or not is another question.
Muratova has a lot of those kind of very strong whites also, actually, in her.
That's really true. That's really true.
It seems to be a part of the visual language of actually that southern area.
Yeah.
Peter, anything to add?
Not on the cinematic front. Back to the earlier discussion about authenticity of language, I'm very ambiguous about that. I haven't studied the Khrushchev period. I wasn't like listening to party debates in the Khrushchev period. I was barely alive. So I'm not sure. I'd be interested to hear from historians, to what extent is that language, the private language, truthful? I mean, it didn't ring true to me. I mean, it didn't strike, it struck me as very forced. So I remain kind of ambiguous about that. There were some obvious anomalies, such as, you know, they refer to Bangladesh, like it's so hot in here, it's as hot as Bangladesh. Bangladesh didn't exist until 1971, right? And there are some anomalies with the toilet design as well, the high or low toilet.
The toilet design gets an inordinate amount of attention for people in the reviews that like to deal with historical accuracy.
Well, there were two crucial scenes in toilets, so I think it's that scrutiny.
And just before we move on to the questions from the audience, of which we have so many, and I hope we'll get to all of them. One last question that goes back to the start of this conversation, but Mark and I both think that it merits to probably raise it again. So one of the first things that everyone remarked on during this webinar, for those of you who are just joining us, was that the film that is dedicated entirely to a workers' demonstration shows no industrial labor, barely any coherent image of a worker protester. So I'd just like to ask our speakers, how do you explain this very poorly veiled disinterest in the actual reality of the worker's life? And where does this kind of extremely anti-materialist stance, if you will, comes from for Koncholovsky?
When you say
well, I would say it's a combination of the Russian elite that we talked about earlier at some length, plus 75 years of Soviet communism kind of ad nauseum about the proletariat. So I think people are just sick of hearing about the proletariat. So that's a double whammy from which Russian labor is never going to recover, I'm afraid. So I guess we shouldn't be surprised.
I wanted to say in response to both Peter and to Dasha, in a sense, I was struck by the first time that I ever found out about Novocherkassk when I was in graduate school. I was reading Akhmatova's diaries. No, I'm sorry, not Akhmatova's diary, Tchaikovsky's diary, right? Tchaikovsky's diary of Akhmatova, notes on Akhmatova. And there's a moment in those notes when she says, when Akhmatova whispers to her, like, have you heard about Novocherkassk? And she says, yes. And they have like a very, very brief thing. There wasn't a whole lot. But that moment made me feel that is the kind of that kind of conversation of not necessarily putting it down to paper, but if you just generally thinking of like how intense some of those conversations are in those kinds of documents, like Notes on Akhmatova, in terms of like how much they are sort of like trying to grapple with the post-Stalin situation, what the limits of the possible, what should be done, what shouldn't, etc. So to me, that part actually did kind of feel true. I think the forced element is maybe that they're speaking so much, right? That there's so much speaking about it, and instead of like sort of other techniques of rendering that. But I don't know. I mean, I was fairly convinced by that aspect, and so the other thing I wanted to say is that I kept thinking this whole time because they're constantly walking through all these secret passageways, right? And they're always inside of these various kinds of like power cabinet positions, right? And they're always sort of being shuttled from one space of power to another space of power. I was thinking the whole time, it's like some kind of like a Medici story here, right? When you like go to Florence and you see that big long corridor that connects the Pitti Palace to like the other palace, and the whole thing just happens in there, and somebody might stab you, but like nobody particularly cares what happens outside. So I definitely think that like that part of the kind of the visual language of like rendering that kind of self-enclosed world of this elite, of just shuttling them through all of these secret passageways, including like the first big passageway that you see is when she goes and gets the food, right? Inside through all of they go through all these winding things, and then they go what looks to be like some sort of a drug deal in the back room, right over that table. And also I was going to say that the other thing this film constantly does these rhyming shots. It constantly will set up that passageway and then rhyme it with the next time when the elites are driving through the crowd to get to the factory. A lot of times you will have there was a lot of another rhyming shot was like the water, right? The place being like the square being washed in the beginning of the film, and then later being washed of the blood a little later. There's a lot of that mode of like of circularity to the way that this film sort of structures the coherence of its story. But I don't know, like with the rhyming, I mean, beyond the obvious meaning of it, I don't know what else to do with it.
John, what's your response? Like I could see, or Peter, I couldn't tell which one of you went on mute first.
I was No, no. It's just I was listening to Pavel, and I was just thinking another kind of motif. This is partially visual and partially narrative and so on. But the absence of a chorny hod, the absence of a back exit, right? There's no, you can't get, she can't get out of the back way. She has to go through the hall, right? They can't get out of the factory. They have to go up, right? And there's that funny moment when Basov, right, who really did get sort of historically got into trouble for this, right? He's looking through this manhole and so forth, and right, and he's so he's so heavy. Maybe it's only a middle-aged guy like me who can understand this humor and so forth, but he's worried he's not going to get through the hole, right? It's actually quite amusing. But I have to say I remain perplexed by I've read a few things that Koncholovsky has said about this and that. I mean, he said, I love the Soviet Union and I hate the Soviet Union, this type. I mean, sort of in the aggregate, from what I can tell, his politics are kind of a fairly kind of typical kind of sort of conservative kind of sort of ideology that isn't particularly distinctive, and I'm not sure how coherent it is. But it does raise the question of why he would make this film. I mean, we know that Vysotsky, his wife, partner, the star of the film, is from there. He did say in an interview in Novaya Gazeta that he wouldn't have made the film if she weren't from there, but that's just not plausible. I mean, that can't be the only reason. Again, I can only see it in some way as, and I guess this relates to what Peter was saying, as a kind of a problem of political and historical imagination, that it's just simply impossible for a person of his particular formation, I guess, to somehow imagine in a way that's not effectively abstract and devoid of all content, what the real nature of the complexities of the workers' demands might have been, right? Perhaps it would have also had to involve situating the whole story into larger social economic questions, right? Because of course, why were they raising prices? Well, it was because they were having trouble, getting enough food production in the collective farms and so forth. It's sort of a NEP-like situation in some ways, right? And they wanted to keep all these balls in the air. They wanted to keep the whole, they wanted to keep up the economic development. They wanted to keep the standard of living rising, which it had been, and so forth. They wanted to stay a superpower, and so they made this crazy decision to raise the prices on a lot of foodstuffs by almost a third.
Yeah.
Overnight, almost a third, right? I mean, this is, and it's one thing that's interesting is that they actually, this is a gesture that was not repeated after this. It never happened again. And so, I mean, it would be, to my mind, we've already talked, and I've seen, I think Masha Spolberg mentioned this too, the personalization of history, and several others, several of our panelists have mentioned this too, right? I think that precisely in order to, one would really have to go beyond that, and beyond that kind of personal melodrama that really lies at the center of the film, and really contextualize the film. I mean, it's what was striking to me also thinking about the film, even as a kind of an export product, but even as a product for the Russian audience, is the absence of even the sort of banal before and after. Like you would think, like you get in fiction films, right? So on June 1st in Pravda, there was this announcement about the raising price, and then in the aftermath, then you'd have 7 people were condemned to death, however many ended up going to prison, et cetera, et cetera. This is a very typical kind of thing. You find this in fiction films like Dunkirk or whatever, right? This kind of stuff, right? None of it. Like, it's just not even, I mean, that's not even hard to do, right? I mean, it would be more difficult to actually, for instance, integrate scenes, like truly write up scenes that integrated conversations with workers and so forth, going in, there'd have to be a different kind of sets where they would go into workers' houses and so forth. Like I said, some people were living in tents and barracks. I don't know if you're aware of this, but Novocherkassk was completely divided into the main city and then this industrial place that was across the river where all the workers lived. Samuel Barron in his book has a nice map of this and so forth. So there was a literal geographical split in terms of who was living where, right? This is one of the reasons why the whole idea of their marching into town was such a anxiety creating thing. But Koncholovsky just seems either unable or incapable of going down this path. Again, I'm still sort of stuck, to be honest with you.
Yeah, I mean,
Thank you.
seven of the strikers were executed, right?
Exactly.
Which is pretty extreme, and others got 13
Exactly.
year labor camp sentences.
Absolutely.
And I did find online there was a kind of fairly pedestrian TV drama called Однажды в Ростове about a criminal group that came out of Rostov during those years. And the first 2 episodes of this 6-part serial are set in Novocherkassk. And they, for me, did a much better job of giving. It's not that complicated to explain, the plight of the workers, and they dramatize it in a very cheaply made, I think, TV serial. But there was more content in that than in this film. So I think that wasn't what Koncholovsky was trying to do. Clearly, he wasn't trying to show the workers' point of view at all.
I think we're running out of time, and we do have quite a few questions to get to. Just kind of one quick comment to piggyback on what Peter and John were saying, right? We're talking about personalization of history, but that also speaks to who Koncholovsky might be targeting in Russia today, because there surely is a brand of Russian liberal opposition with this kind of classically anti-materialist view of how things currently work in Russia, primarily restricted to Moscow and Petersburg. And the opposition in the region is, of course, hugely different in Russia in terms of both, in terms of many elements, but primarily in terms of class, which is to say their ideology would, of course, is of course much different than kind of metropolitan liberal intelligentsia opposition that I think Koncholovsky sees as the primary one. Mark, would you like to walk us through the questions?
I think we should move to questions. We have very many, and some of them we have already answered. So I apologize before our audience. I will use some questions and skip others. And I'm very grateful from all of us for the questions and the comments that you gave us. So one question, and basically there's several questions, still associated with the issue of the this KGB character, KGB figure, right? So Liz Malinkin writes, thank you so much for this great discussion. I was curious if anyone would found believable the KGB agent's sudden desire to help Luba. I didn't feel that turn was developed enough and would be interested in your thoughts. And Justin Williams, our participant, asks the question that sort of is about the same thing, but from a different perspective. If we want to be a little more charitable to the film, might we view it not as an elitist treatment of the Narod/worker, but as a story simply focused on another milieu, namely on bureaucrats and authorities, their acute ambivalence to the system and their position as both victims and executioners. So can you think about this character, this KGB beloved man, potentially, right? And definitely one of the most sympathetic characters in the film, as not only the sort of the inertia of today's TV and cinema, where светлый образ сотрудника НКВД is a must. The сотрудника органов is a must. Some kind of the Dr. Machina, but also some kind of the reflection, ideological reflection of the idea that power is brutal, but what do you think?
Well, can I just say, because this was a question I had, I just wanted to interject here, is that his decision to do this, when he goes and he actually approaches Luda, follows pretty much directly upon his conversation in the car with this general, right? right? When he's sitting in the back and he's having this absolutely terrifying figure, right? Who's sitting in the front, and he's who waxes lyrical about the best way to tie hands together while you have them over a ravine and blow their brains out, right? All the people and so forth. And again, this is, I have to say, I wanted to get the sense of people who know more about this than I do, because I wasn't sure, again, there was a whole sort of set of historical associations that could be totally erroneous that sprang to my mind. So he goes and he lifts up his hand, and you see his watch, and you see the tattoo. Is this the tattoo of somebody? Is this a camp tattoo? Is this what that meant, right? Because remember, he also says that remember he says socialism is also a state secret in this country, right? So is this, so here's the narrative that immediately sort of projected itself into my mind. This guy is a veteran of the Yezhov era NKVD, okay, 37, 38. He was involved with mass killings, okay. Yezhov gets replaced by Daria and so forth, with all those people end up getting purged in various ways, killed or sent to camps. He survives, ends up getting back out, and gets back into the KGB, right? And is I mean, sometimes people were reinstated into positions of considerable authority, though I'm not sure how realistic this particular one would be, right? So that was my impression, is that this is a guy who, he's actually, in other words, he's one of these criminal elements, effectively, right? Who was receiving amnesty from, and yet, of course, is actually a super criminal element in the sense. And it was that confrontation with this guy, with this other era, because Victor seems a little bit younger than Lyuda, like a little. So he seems to be more, almost closer to Svetka's age, perhaps sort of between the two of them. And so there's this moment somehow where he's sort of confronted with the true terrifying history of his own organization that he wasn't fully aware of, and so on. Again, I don't know, maybe this is what, I mean, certainly that there is something of that kind of chronology of events in the film that is being presented, I think, as maybe semi-explanatory of his actions.
Can I try out another genealogy of that guy? Here's another possible genealogy of the general. He is born sometime around 1900. He is in his 60s. He was basically in some sort of criminal stuff before the revolution, or even during the revolution and during the early wars, right? He was one of those people who ended up being rounded up as the lumpen proletariat, gets rounded up and becomes particularly good at killing. And so he is run up through the rungs of Soviet power and becomes this either the Civil War inductee into the KGB, right? Which in the kind of especially in the traditional liberal opposition circles, they always talk about the KGB as this shpana, right? As all those people who originally are the criminal elements that the Soviet power comes in and gives them, and just gives them a gun and says, here, do what you do. And that's his lineage, and that's his original tattoo. So in a sense, I don't know, the idea of him getting rolled up after mass killings, after Yezhov, and making it out alive, and then being a general, to me really stretches the possibility, unless there are cases like that. I
know of cases of people. So, for instance, in Figes's book, The Whisperers, there are examples of people who went and did serious time and so forth, and ended up basically being reinstated in various ways. Now, whether or not this would happen within the organy, like within the KGB, that's another question. I'm not sure. But yeah, your genealogy makes perfect sense to me. I mean, but it was just simply too demonstrative an act for it not to be explained. I mean, this is something that he's showing to this guy, like this kind of historical trace and so forth. So take a look at this guy and draw your own conclusions. Right.
He also speaks, right? He says oh, well, Moret Narod is right? He speaks in this that he has this devilish response. Oh, now теперь меня хочешь взять на мушку, right? Are you now? Do you now think that that I'm being the whatever, right? The
target,
heretic or whatever.
The crosshairs, yeah.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. so he tempts him in that way of like nothing is true and anything is possible, sort of classic imagination of the KGB, right?
I think that kind of the whole business with Namushko makes me agree with you, Pasha, about like the fact that he probably is former Shpana, like that kind of the way of like carrying himself almost seems to borrow from that lingo.
But don't you think that he is sort of the counterpart to Victor, right? Basically, nobody has any faith into revolutionary idea. Maybe Luda is the last one who sings this song, right? From Vesna.
Which is also by Sergei Mikhalkov. So not just the anthem, but the song that Luda sings in the car twice is also by Mikhalkov, the father.
The parent, right? So everybody caring is only about their position and what the superiors say. But some of them are just straightforward cynics, as this general, and some of them are better people. So был бы человек хороший. It doesn't matter what position he holds, right? If it is a better person, and that's exactly what she says in there, we will be better. That's it. We will be nicer people, right? The system is unchangeable. The revolution will always be suppressed, right? But we may be nicer, and that exactly agrees with what Peter said about everyone breaking the rules, right? So break the rules in the direction of sort of small acts of kindness. That's the only moral message that I can squeeze out of this film, or ideology for that matter.
Do you think it's a believable ending, or that it's meant to be believable? I mean, after all that's happened, I mean, that's one problem I had with that conclusion, is that this seemed to be just another piece of boilerplate, and that certainly Svyetka wouldn't believe it, and I'm not sure that Lyuda believed it either. I mean, that's again these final pronouncements on the roof. I don't know. That was.
We have a commentary from Masha Spolberg on that. One of the things
we're totally supposed to take it at face value, John. I think it might be boilerplate, but I think that's exactly what he wants us to. And that's based on kind of Koncholovsky's more recent works. That's my hunch. Anyway, sorry, Mark, didn't mean to interrupt.
No. That's a great comment, Peter.
What, Peter? What do you say?
That for Hollywood, for a Western audience, you need a happy ending, right?
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
It's as happy as the ending of Uncle Vanya, I would say. It's almost a quotation from Uncle Vanya.
Well, you can't end on death.
In
this case, I think in this case, like ending on Svetka's death would be logical, but not within how Koncholovsky makes his films, and possibly not also in terms of the international market, like Peter said. Yeah.
I mean, to answer the question,
Pasha's narrative.
I was going to say, to answer the question of whether it's believable, I think the thing that authorizes the conversion is the Christian plot. And that's one of those things where if you're on the inside, it's believable. And if you're on the outside, you're like, I don't know. Right. So I think that that's the Christian logic for her, is what's given her with that. And I mean, with the guy like whips out an icon and just sets it down, he's like wearing his like World War I regalia. I mean, you're looking at that. Is this really happening? How did this just suddenly happen?
Yeah.
But
right.
I had the problem with realism there, with the whole icon Lampase thing. So, and which makes me further think that there is, I mean, if it's not believable, then Koncholovsky is kind of infantilizing his audience, which is not a huge surprise considering how big of an elitist he is and how didactic both his and Nikita's work can get. So.
And how much of a conversion is it? I mean, if she's still praising Stalin, basically, still virtually to the end of the film.
Well, so this is what I think I said in my opening, because I really think that there's a qualitatively different form of praising Stalin in the end. In the end, that praise of Stalin is no longer the Stalin of the elite party apparatchik, but it's now the Stalin of the Narod. This is the Stalin that when you go into the shops, outside of the whatever baracholki, you can buy a little icon, that's made with Stalin as on the front, or like the Stalin that we're gonna paint as an icon inside of this khram of this church. You guys heard about this, right? How they were all set to paint him inside of this military chapel that they just built, right? But then they sort of got cold feet in the last moment and they painted someone else in the spot. So I feel like that's who Stalin is in the end when she refers
Yeah,
to him.
but what does it change? I remember myself how in the 70s truck drivers were pasting the picture of Stalin on their windshield and pasting it with the face outside so that the crowd would see, the people would see that they are nostalgic for Stalin. That was in the 70s. I was a schoolboy back then, so it's not a new event. There's nothing new about that. It's exactly from the 60s and 70s, right? And this sentiment that all the havoc is happening because Stalin is not with us. It's from there. It is more or less true. But the question is how much is Koncholovsky sort of enforcing it? But let's ask us some other question because our audience will be very angry with us. So here is the commentary from Masha Spolberg, and maybe one will pick the question, then we'll move to another one. One of the things that struck me about the film is how much it feels like a pastiche of moments from Russian film, literature, and art. Vysotsky is made to look like Veronica from The Cranes, flying the naked boys bathing in the lake with their horses straight out of Petrov Vodkin. The final scene smacks of the ending of Uncle Vanya. I'd like to hear what any of the panelists have to say about the way this film is consciously presenting itself not only as an Oscars contender for the West, but also trying to inscribe itself into the great Russian tradition. Any comments? Pasha, great Russian tradition is your field.
I have to say I wasn't paying attention to
Take it away
when I was watching the film. And then when Masha said it, I mean, I agree, right? Like, I think that Masha spelled it out very nicely. Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I like there's these kinds of like I'm like wondering why was it that this film picked up this kind of this resonance of it being special or being brave or being right? Didn't it win the Venice Film Festival or something, or it was screened there? What was that?
It was there. It was there.
It was there.
So like, I mean, in terms of getting that recognition, is that recognition really reliant on Chekhovianism? Is that recognition really just if you put in enough long still shots in black and white in your film, you get to go to Venice? Like, how does that work? Like, is that what's happening?
Pasha, I don't want to say that this is how it's happening, but there is a lot of black and white films that are quite, I wouldn't say that they have like all of the artistic merit in the world that do make it quite often to film festivals, both domestic and international. So I'm not sure that the kind of Pawlikovsky's visuals are accidental there.
Yeah.
Maybe we can. So we're answering with a question to the question, which tells a lot about our group. Us, right? And I think we can continue this line of thought by Ben Rifkin's question. And Ben, thank you for your commentaries. I'm wondering if one of the panelists tonight could comment on how the film could be relevant to events unfolding in the USA. So maybe there is some kind of relevance that we are overlooking here.
Well, I would say on the question of language, it's the question of was that Stalinist language the kind of language people were using? I can imagine the same problem if you're making a movie about Trump supporters. You know, it's very hard for liberals, I think, to get their head inside the worldview of the MAGA hat crowd, and you know, I don't find Hillbilly Elegy particularly convincing on that score at all. And so I think we've got a lot of work to do on this side as well in bridging the elite mass divide. So it is a challenge, definitely.
Well, so I mean, I think that it's
and Peter, I'm sorry, I should comment that Peter was answering the question that I haven't read, but Peter read it. Was Mila Fedorov's question about the language the characters speak. Sorry. Yes.
I want to just piggyback on what you just said, which is that like this eternity of the state, right? This idea also that the elites are the elites, the narod is the narod, right? This idea that the elites are the only subjects of history, right? This key post-Soviet state idea that it's all the same anywhere you go, right? It's all the same, right? They're all the same. It's all, none of their planes are really flying, right? This like cargo cult kind of statement that you get very straight up in Pererin, right? I think that in that sense, but it always pronounced in the kind of in that kind of statement always comes along with a tremendous amount of bad faith, and I think that to that extent, like to speak to the events in the USA, and to speak to them again from this vantage point of like elite consensus or elite misunderstandings. I was stuck on the name of the film, right? I kept thinking about this, Дорогие товарищи, and this is again why I thought of Kira Muratova, right? And this is the opposite of what happens in that film. In that film, remember how she stands around and she doesn't know how to write the speech, right? And she keeps repeating, dear comrades, dear comrades, dear comrades. And she can't write the speech because she can't give the speech because she doesn't believe what she's saying. She can't recommend that all these people go. And like in that film, she's supposed to convince a bunch of like Komsomol people, I think, to like go move to the countryside and like and work in the kolkhoz, right? And she's like, I don't believe that I can do this, right? Like that's like the arc in the story arc. Like you can't just like get people to do this. People have to like love it, right? This is a total opposite of that, right? There she kind of comes to the realization that no, like you have to like be more real about real life. These abstract address as comrades doesn't really get at like the needs that the people really have. And so, right, her sort of arc as an administrator inside of this small town is basically to come to recognize that to some extent. So she always recognizes that, really. She's a very positive character, right? Whereas here, this dear comrades, and she sits down and she starts writing, okay, I wrote dear comrades, what next? And she doesn't know, right? And then the guy tells her, and then she just, writes everything down. And what she writes down is this perfect sort of like perfectly packaged, CPSU type of address to the comrades. And it's all bullshit, right? And it's, I'm right, the film was basically staging an absolute impossibility of a successful interpolation, right? From the elites to the Narod. The idea that you can go out there and actually address these people and actually have something to say to them, right? Even though there is this moment that, right, like I kept thinking also about the character of Mckay. Mckay comes off looking pretty good here, doesn't he?
Такие товарищи, she says, такие товарищи.
Yeah.
When she sits next to the dog metaphor, like it's like a minute before she said, Mikayan, такие товарищи.
Yeah.
But Mikayan was a good cop next to Kozlov, who was a bad cop. So that was the drama that was played out sort of by default. But I want to pick.
Mark, just a very quick question, since Pasha brought up references to дорогие товарищи, that's this question of speech and language. The film that I mentioned, Panfilov's Прошу слова with Uvarova, that is kind of a better, more sophisticated, more complex from the time character of what Vysotskaya became in Dear Comrades. That's also Прошу слова, I wish to speak. And again, lots of party address themes. So I think it's there's definitely a topic when it comes to this kind of personal, private, and sedition, etc.
But if I may also continue what Pasha said, Pasha, you provoke us to fight for the floor. That basically this film is loyalist, exactly as Pasha said, because it argues that the history is written by elites. A very banal thought, right? But that has been sort of criticized so many times, beginning with Benjamin and others, right? Actually, what John was discussing about the static camera is exactly this position. The position of the elite is the same. It doesn't matter what ideology they subscribe to. They are always the same. It is exactly the same class that rules Russia, maybe not only Russia, and that's the relevance outside. And that's what makes this film super conservative. And that's what makes this film very much loyalist, even it depicts apparently the people's protest and resonates with Ukrainian revolution or attempts of revolution in Russia. But the point there is that elites are the stable perspective. They are unmovable. And in this respect, this is very much self-pleasing film. I'm sorry to say that, right? So, and self-indulgent in many ways. And this idea also sounded. So probably the last question that we can pick up is the question from Oksana Nesterenko, and we partially answered it, but if somebody would like to comment, I would be very grateful. After watching this film, audience with insufficient knowledge of Soviet history, which may include some people currently living in Russia, may get an impression that all problems really started when Khrushchev came to power, and that Stalin was a positive figure. That somehow corresponds to a view of history promoted by Putin. Do you think that Koncholovsky intended this? Maybe to get an official support in Russia, but I doubt that he needs to enhance his official support. He is the official support himself. Do you want to add anything to what was said already?
Yeah, that seems accurate to me. That Khrushchev is getting dumped on in this film, and let's face it, Khrushchev was great improvement on his predecessors. So I think there's some radical historical revisionism going on here, and that much at least does seem intentional.
Thank you.
I would agree.
Definitely.
All right. Yeah, Pasha, go.
I was gonna say you can always do this thing where like Khrushchev and Gorbachev are the well-meaning wreckers, right? Who ruin everything with all of their desire to reinterpolate the populace, right? But they don't understand is that this gesture is meaningless, that this dear comrades, that those are just words, they aren't really your comrades, and you know that, and they know that, and nothing is going to happen, and you can go out and you can pretend that they're your comrades all you want, but really you know that they're the narod. Really you know that they are this totally self-enclosed, unmoved mass that, mystically moves history without actually doing anything. Right, and that's where that connects to melodrama. And I think that's what Nancy Conde talks about in her book. Also, this buckle of history. I think she's also quoting someone else when she's speaking about that. But that idea that the buckle of history is this thing, this feeling that no one is really in control, but the only forces that are in control are sort of a mystical force that's sort of like beyond your understanding. And the narod is basically that. And every time somebody like Khrushchev comes in and tries to act on that, he becomes the fool of the joke, in a sense.
Thank you.
On that very optimistic note.
And with a lot of gratitude to our panelists and to our audience, which was incredibly active, and that's a huge achievement. We would like to finish today's conversation, which I think was incredibly productive. Thank you
very much.
It was a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for the invitation. Thanks, everybody.